In the chaos of World War II, thousands of tanks were destroyed, abandoned, or quietly erased from history. But one broken Sherman refused to disappear. For decades, official records insisted it never mattered, never fought, never changed anything. Yet buried inside a forgotten maintenance log is a single line that makes no sense unless something extraordinary happened behind the front lines in 1943. A mechanic with no rank, no authority, and no permission made a decision that night that could have gotten him court-martialed or killed. Commanders later denied it, engineers dismissed it, and historians overlooked it. But by the end of this story, you'll understand why the truth about that crazy repair was buried and why it terrified everyone who knew it worked.
On 14 July 1943, the rain had already turned the fields of southern Italy into a thick, choking sea of mud. Trucks sank to their axles, boots came off with every step, and the smell of fuel, wet canvas, and fear hung low over the Allied repair yards. The fighting was moving north, fast and brutal, but behind the front lines, another war was being fought quietly, one against broken machines, impossible deadlines, and the knowledge that every failure meant more men would die the next morning. It was here, far from glory and gunfire, that the Sherman tank with the faded serial number rolled in on a tow cable, already condemned by everyone who saw it. The tank had taken a hit during a chaotic engagement 2 days earlier. Not a clean penetration, not the kind that made headlines, but something worse. A German round had slammed into the suspension at an angle that twisted the drivetrain just enough to cripple it without destroying it. The engine coughed and stalled under load. The turret still turned, the gun still fired, but the tank couldn't move more than a few yards without grinding itself to death. To frontline commanders, that made it useless. A tank that couldn't maneuver was a coffin waiting to happen. The decision was immediate and final. Strip it for parts, mark it for salvage, move on. Private First Class Daniel Mercer heard that verdict while standing ankle-deep in mud, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had once been white. Mercer wasn't famous, wasn't educated beyond trade school, and certainly wasn't an engineer. He was a mechanic because he'd grown up fixing tractors and trucks in rural Ohio, because engines made sense to him in a world that increasingly didn't. To officers, he was invisible. To paperwork, he was a serial number. But to machines, Mercer had a habit of listening when everyone else had already given up. He walked around the Sherman slowly, ignoring the shouts and laughter of other mechanics who were already pulling usable components. The tank looked wrong to him, not dead, not alive, but caught in between. He crawled underneath, pressed his ear against the hull, and had another mechanic crank the engine briefly. The vibration told him something the reports didn't. The drivetrain wasn't destroyed, it was misaligned. Badly, dangerously, but not beyond saving. Not if someone was willing to take a risk no manual allowed.
The problem was simple to describe and nearly impossible to solve. The Sherman's transmission and final drive had shifted just enough that under stress, the entire system bound itself tight. Engineers back in the States would have called for factory-level repairs. Field manuals offered no solution. The official fix was replacement, and replacement wasn't coming. The Allies were advancing too quickly, supplies stretched too thin, and every tank was needed yesterday. Still, command had already written this one off. Orders were orders. Mercer didn't argue. He never did. He just asked for one night. Permission was denied, of course. There were regulations, schedules, priorities, but rules bent in the dark, especially when no one was watching closely. That night, under a tarp stretched against the rain, Mercer went back to the tank alone. He brought scrap metal, wire, shims scavenged from wrecks, and a notebook filled with sketches no one had asked him to draw. He wasn't trying to restore the tank to factory condition. That would have been impossible. Instead, he was about to do something far more dangerous, something that would change how the tank behaved under stress. He loosened mounts that were never meant to be loosened in the field. He adjusted angles that engineers had calculated to fractions of a degree. Then, against everything he'd been taught, he deliberately introduced controlled tension into the drivetrain, a crude, improvised balance that compensated for the damage instead of fighting it. It was the kind of fix that looked insane on paper and brilliant only if it worked. If it failed, the tank wouldn't just break, it would tear itself apart. By dawn, Mercer was exhausted, soaked, and certain of only one thing. The tank was different now. He didn't know how long it would last. He didn't know if it would kill him for trying. But when the engine started, it didn't choke. When the tank lurched forward, it didn't grind. It moved, slowly at first, then smoother than it had any right to. Mercer stood there in the rain, watching the Sherman crawl forward like something resurrected, knowing that if command discovered what he'd done, his war might end right there. They discovered it anyway.
The test run was supposed to be routine, just another salvaged tank being repositioned before dismantling. But when the Sherman climbed a muddy incline that should have stalled it, heads turned. When it pivoted without locking up, officers stepped closer. And when the driver reported that the tank handled better under uneven load than others in the unit, the questions began. Mercer said nothing. He knew better than to explain something no one wanted to believe. Command faced a choice they didn't like. Officially, the tank was still condemned. Unofficially, it now worked. And worse, it worked differently. In war, anything unexpected was dangerous, especially when it couldn't be explained. But desperation has a way of silencing doubt. The Sherman was quietly reassigned, not to a headline unit, not to a proud formation, but to a sector where losses were expected and questions weren't asked. Mercer watched it roll out of the repair yard 2 days later, its markings hastily repainted, its past erased. No one thanked him, no record credited him. He was ordered back to work on other wrecks, other hopeless cases. But as the tank disappeared down the road, Mercer felt something twist in his chest. Not pride, not fear, but certainty. Whatever he had done hadn't just saved a machine. It had changed how that machine would behave when things went wrong.
Weeks later, rumors began to drift back through the repair lines. Stories of a Sherman that kept moving when others bogged down. Of a tank that handled stress differently, unpredictably. Officers dismissed the talk as coincidence, exaggeration, superstition. But Mercer listened, and each story sounded uncomfortably familiar. The tank wasn't supposed to do those things, and yet it was. By the end of that summer, reports involving that unit were quietly reclassified. After-action notes went missing, mechanical data was omitted, and one short maintenance log entry, written in careful, neutral language, was filed and forgotten. It mentioned an unauthorized field adjustment and concluded that the results were non-repeatable. That sentence would become the foundation of a lie that lasted decades. Mercer survived the war. He never spoke publicly about what he'd done. He didn't need to. He knew that somewhere in the chaos of 1943, a decision made in the mud had rippled outward in ways no one could fully measure yet. And as the fighting intensified, that Sherman would soon face a moment that would force the truth into the open, whether command wanted it or not. But that moment hadn't come yet.
On 3 September 1943, the morning fog clung low to the valleys as Allied armor crept forward through territory that maps still labeled uncertain. The front had shifted again, faster than planners predicted, and units were being pushed into terrain no one had studied long enough to trust. Hills folded into one another like knuckles, narrow roads funneled vehicles into predictable paths, and German anti-tank crews had already learned where patience paid best. It was into this uneasy landscape that the repaired Sherman was sent, assigned to a mixed unit tasked with probing defenses that intelligence insisted were thin. Intelligence, as usual, was wrong. The crew had not asked for this tank. When it arrived, freshly painted and outwardly ordinary, there was nothing to suggest it was different from the others parked nearby. The commander, a young lieutenant already tired of replacements and reassurances, noted only that its maintenance records were oddly sparse. The driver noticed something else almost immediately. The controls felt unfamiliar, heavier in some moments, smoother in others, as if the tank responded not with rigid predictability, but with a strange tolerance for strain. He said nothing. In war, tanks that worked were not questioned too closely. The first engagement came suddenly. A sharp crack echoed from the ridge ahead, followed by the unmistakable impact of metal on armor somewhere to the left. The column halted. Infantry scattered for cover as German guns revealed themselves in brief, deadly flashes. The lieutenant ordered the Shermans forward, one by one, to suppress the positions. Two bogged down almost immediately, track spinning uselessly in the churned mud. Another lurched, stalled, and became a target within seconds. Smoke rose. Men shouted. Training dissolved into instinct. The repaired Sherman moved.
Not quickly, not heroically, but steadily. Where others fought the ground, it seemed to accept it. The drivetrain flexed under stress in a way no one inside could explain, absorbing misalignment instead of amplifying it. The tank crawled forward, its engine note uneven but persistent, its tracks finding purchase where logic said they shouldn't. The gunner brought the main cannon to bear and fired, the recoil rocking the hull violently. Any other Sherman might have locked up under that sudden load. This one did not. The German crew had expected hesitation, maybe confusion. They did not expect a tank that refused to stop advancing. The second shot came too late. The ridge went silent, save for the crackle of burning brush and the ringing in the crew's ears. The lieutenant stared through his periscope, trying to reconcile what he'd just seen with what he thought he knew about Shermans in terrain like this. He chalked it up to luck. Commanders often did. Over the next 2 days, the tank continued to behave oddly. It handled slopes without the familiar protest of metal under stress. It absorbed abrupt changes in speed and direction with a resilience that bordered on unnatural. The crew began to trust it in ways they didn't trust the others. When routes narrowed or ground softened, they volunteered to lead. When orders came down to push forward despite uncertainty, they complied without argument. Confidence once earned became momentum. Rumors spread quickly. Infantry units whispered about a Sherman that never seemed to bog down. Drivers from other crews tested their own tanks harder, hoping to replicate whatever magic they imagined was at work. None succeeded. The difference wasn't dramatic enough to spark immediate investigation, but it was consistent. And consistency in war attracted attention. By mid-September, reports reached battalion command that conflicted with established mechanical doctrine. The tank's performance metrics didn't align with known tolerances. Stress readings should have indicated imminent failure. Instead, the machine endured. Engineers attached to the unit were perplexed and quietly uneasy. One suggested pulling the tank for inspection. Another advised leaving it alone. The lieutenant, now protective of the machine that had carried his crew through fire, sided with silence. The real test came during a counterattack no one had anticipated.
German forces, regrouping under cover of night, struck along a narrow corridor just before dawn. The terrain forced Allied armor into a brutal funnel with little room to maneuver and even less margin for error. Tanks that stalled became obstacles. Obstacles became graves. The repaired Sherman was third in line when the shooting started, trapped behind a disabled vehicle and exposed to fire from the flanks.
The driver made a decision he later claimed he didn't remember making. He pushed the engine harder than regulations allowed. The tank shuddered violently, the drivetrain screaming in protest. Inside, every man braced for the sound of catastrophic failure. Instead, the Sherman surged sideways, climbing over broken ground at an angle that should have snapped mounts clean through. The improvised tension Mercer had introduced months earlier redistributed the stress in ways no blueprint ever envisioned. The tank didn't fight the damage, it worked around it. They broke free. The maneuver opened a path for infantry to withdraw and allowed other tanks to reposition. The counterattack faltered, then collapsed. When the sun rose, the battlefield told a familiar story of wreckage and loss, but one detail stood out. The repaired Sherman sat where it had no right to be, intact and operational. Officers took notice this time. Questions followed, quiet ones at first, then sharper. Maintenance officers demanded explanations. Engineers requested inspections. The tank was pulled back not for punishment, but for scrutiny. Mercer's unauthorized adjustments were discovered within hours. The reaction was swift and conflicted. What he had done violated regulations, bypassed safety margins, and defied established engineering logic. It also worked.
Command faced a problem with no clean solution. Acknowledging the modification meant admitting that doctrine was incomplete, that a low-ranking mechanic had stumbled onto something professionals hadn't considered. Ignoring it meant discarding a potential advantage. In the end, the safest path was chosen. The fix was labeled an anomaly. The tank was cleared for continued use, but forbidden from being replicated. Officially, it was a fluke. Unofficially, copies of Mercer's notes began to circulate among select maintenance crews, stripped of names and context. Mercer himself never learned how far his idea traveled. He was reassigned shortly afterward, moved to another repair yard under the guise of routine rotation. No reprimand came, no commendation either. Silence was his reward. He understood what that meant. Some truths were useful only as long as they remained deniable. As autumn deepened and the war pressed on, the repaired Sherman continued to fight, accumulating a quiet reputation that never reached the newspapers. Its presence altered outcomes in subtle ways, holding ground a little longer, pushing a little farther, surviving where statistics said it shouldn't. Each engagement added weight to a question no one wanted to ask aloud. What if the manuals were wrong? By the time winter approached, the tank's logbook was a mess of redactions and vague entries. Dates blurred, locations vanished, performance notes grew increasingly generic. Someone, somewhere, was smoothing the record, not to erase failure, but to hide success that couldn't be explained without discomfort. The truth was becoming dangerous. Because soon, the tank would face an enemy that exposed its secret in a way no report could bury, a confrontation that would force command to choose between admitting what had been done or making sure no one ever spoke of it again. That reckoning was approaching fast, and when it arrived, the fate of one crazy repair and the man behind it would finally be decided.
On 11th February 1944, the sky over central Italy was clear in a way that felt unnatural for a war that had learned to hide behind clouds and smoke. Visibility stretched for miles, exposing every movement, every mistake. It was the kind of day commanders hated and gunners loved. Somewhere along a battered ridgeline, German armor had dug in, confident in terrain that favored ambush and in weapons designed to punish Allied tanks long before they could respond. Intelligence warned of Panthers operating in the area, fast, powerful, and lethal at range. For most Sherman crews, that knowledge sat heavy in the chest. For one particular tank crew, it would become a moment of reckoning. The repaired Sherman had survived months longer than anyone expected. Its exterior now bore the scars of repeated engagements, layers of paint scuffed away to bare metal, weld marks dulled by dirt and soot. Inside, the crew moved with an ease that came only from long familiarity and shared survival. They trusted the machine, though none of them fully understood it. They only knew it had saved them before, and in war, that was enough. The engagement began with a mistake. A forward observer misjudged distance. Artillery fell short. The German response was immediate and precise. A panther revealed itself from behind cover, its long barrel swinging with deliberate calm. The first shot missed narrowly, slamming into the hillside behind the Sherman and showering it with rock and dust. The second shot was already coming. The lieutenant ordered evasive movement, but the ground offered little room. Any standard maneuver would have exposed the tank's weaker side armor. The driver reacted instinctively, pushing the engine hard while turning sharply across uneven ground. Inside the hull, the strain was enormous. The drivetrain absorbed forces far beyond what designers had intended. This was the moment Mercer's modification was never meant to survive. Instead, it held. The Sherman lurched violently, but stayed mobile, its internal stresses redistributed rather than concentrated. The Panther's next shot struck at an angle, glancing instead of penetrating. The gunner fired back, the shell impacting the Panther's turret ring with a force that stalled it momentarily. Infantry scrambled, smoke bloomed, the battlefield compressed into seconds of chaos. What followed was not a heroic duel the way later stories would frame it. It was messy, desperate, and uncertain. The Sherman maneuvered aggressively, exploiting terrain features that should have immobilized it. Each movement placed abnormal loads on damaged components that by all logic should have failed catastrophically. Yet they did not. The tank behaved less like a rigid machine and more like a system that bent without breaking. The Panther was eventually disabled, not destroyed outright, but forced to withdraw under covering fire. The engagement ended without clear victory, but something far more dangerous had occurred. Too many witnesses had seen what the Sherman could do. Too many officers had felt the uncomfortable realization that this was not luck. Within days, the tank was pulled from the line. No explanation was given to the crew. Orders came down citing routine inspection, fatigue analysis, and operational rotation. The crew protested quietly, then stopped. They had learned the limits of questioning long ago. The Sherman was transported to a rear facility under heavy guard, its logbooks confiscated, its markings stripped. Mercer was not there to see it. By then, he had been reassigned again, his trail intentionally obscured by administrative noise. What happened next never appeared in official histories. The tank was dismantled carefully, not for salvage but for study. Engineers documented every abnormal stress pattern, every improvised adjustment, every unintended consequence of Mercer's decision. Their conclusions were troubling. The fix worked not because it corrected the damage, but because it accepted imperfection and compensated dynamically. It violated core assumptions of mechanical doctrine, assumptions built around ideal conditions rather than battlefield reality.
Admitting that truth would have forced a re-evaluation of training, design philosophy, and hierarchy. It would have meant acknowledging that innovation could emerge from desperation, not authorization. That was a dangerous idea in an army built on control, so a compromise was reached. The data was classified, the tank was labeled an anomaly, Mercer's name was removed entirely. By the time the war ended, the Sherman was gone, officially scrapped, unofficially dismantled beyond recognition. Mercer returned home, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that he had changed something no one would ever thank him for. He never patented an idea, never wrote a memoir, never corrected the record. When asked about the war, he spoke only in generalities. Machines, he believed, didn't need glory.
Decades later, historians would stumble upon that maintenance log entry, the one that made no sense. Unauthorized field adjustment, it read. Results non-repeatable. That phrase, repeated in archives and footnotes, was accepted without challenge for generations. Few bothered to ask why it needed to be written at all. The truth is, the result was repeatable, quietly, selectively. Long after Mercer's tank was gone, similar principles appeared in armored design, reframed, sanitized, attributed to committees and laboratories. The idea that flexibility under stress could outperform rigid perfection became doctrine, just never credited to where it began. That is why the story was buried. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well and from the wrong hands. A single mechanic in the mud behind the front lines made a decision that exposed a weakness not in a tank, but in the system that built it. And systems, especially in war, do not forgive that easily. The Sherman tank that everyone had written off did not win the war. It didn't change its outcome overnight. What it did was far more unsettling. It proved that sometimes the most dangerous ideas are not new weapons, but new ways of thinking, born quietly where no one is supposed to look. And that is why for decades no one talked about it at all.